Okay, good morning everybody. So this is our third lecture in our human biology series, and today we're going to give a look at the human nervous system. Now if you remember, when we talked about homeostasis only yesterday, we said that all of the processes in the human body could be mapped on to a simple feedback loop. And if you remember, it was this diagram you see in front of you. So each loop contained a sensor, an integrator, an interpreter, and an effector come. Now the human nervous system takes an important role in these loops. It is one of the body's key communication systems, and it is communication between these different components that allows for the body processes to proceed. The other communication system we will talk about tomorrow, and that is the chemical communication system, the endocrine system. So first of all, let's have a look at the nervous system with a map of the body. Now on this map I'm showing you two arrows, a red arrow and a blue arrow. The red arrow is showing you the information that leaves the central nervous system and goes into the peripheral nervous system, and the blue arrow is showing you how information passes from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. So, for instance, a sensation felt in the leg of this person is passed up through the nervous system to the brain, and a reaction, if needed, is passed from the brain out to the nervous system. So this is a simple representation of what's going on every second of every day in your body. This communication of information between the nerves and the brain and the spinal cord. Now all of these nerves are made up in a similar way, and although there are probably many hundreds of different shapes and sizes of nerves in the body, they all look roughly the same and have the same components. So here we are. This is what we could call a nerve cell or a neuron. Okay? All nerve cells have these different components. So they all have a cell body, which we call the soma. The cell body contains the nucleus of the cell, which is the control center. The other thing that you will notice is that the cell body is surrounded by these roots or branches. Now these are what are called dendrites. The dendrites, which I think it really means roots, are the receivers of the nerve cell, and that's where information from other nerve cells or different tissues in the body is received. So the stimulus for the nerve cell is passed via the receivers, the dendrites, to the cell body, and the information needed to respond, the response, is then passed from the cell body along a long transmitting process. The transmitting process is known, the transmitting process is known as an axon. Now the axon transmits the information out to the end, where again you might see that the nerve cell again branches, and it branches out into many different branches, each with their own having a terminal button or a bouton. It is from these branches that the information is then passed on to either another nerve cell, to a muscle, to a gland, to various parts of the body. So nerve cells all do the same thing. They receive information and they pass it on. And when they're in long chains, they form the nervous system. Let's move on now and have a look at the way in which the nervous system can be classified. And it can be classified in two real ways. First of all, in a structural manner, according to the structures, and then a functional manner, according to what it does. So this slide shows you the different structural divisions. So we have a central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And there's a very, very easy way of telling which is central nervous system and which is the peripheral nervous system. Because the central nervous system is encased in bone. So the brain is found inside the cranium and the spinal cord is found in the vertebral column. Everything that's outside of that is known as the peripheral nervous system. And structurally, we can see two different types of nerves coming out of the central nervous system, the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. But we will look at those later. Okay? We'll have a bigger look at the structure of these in a few slides' time. We can also give a classification of the human nervous system according to its functions. And on this slide, we can see there are a number of different functions. So up here, one of the key functions of the human nervous system is sensing things. Touching, tasting, hearing, seeing. The nervous system plays an important part in sensing the environment around us and what's going on within our own bodies. The other important thing is movement. The nervous system is vital for moving the body. So there's a part of the nervous system called the motor nervous system, which is responsible for moving things. Now, another type of nervous system works on our internal body processes, such as digestion, as you can see here. And digestion and breathing and heart rate are all what we call vegetative processes. They're not conscious. We don't really have any control over them at all. And that part of the nervous system is known as the autonomic nervous system. And we'll talk about this in a minute in more detail. So those are the three major functions of the nervous system: sensing, moving or motor system, and an autonomic vegetative system. We can see that on the next slide. So we have a sensory nervous system which picks up a range of stimuli from the body and sends to the brain. So whether it's hearing, taste, whether it's touch. Then we have this somatic nervous system, otherwise known as the voluntary motor system. This acts only on our skeletal muscle, the muscle that is arranged in our body to move our bones. And then we have this unconscious vegetative nervous activity, which we call the autonomic nervous system. It's involuntary. That means that we can't control it consciously. And it acts on the important tissues of the body like the heart and the gut and the lungs and the various glands of the body. Okay, so that's a bit of classification. Now let's have a look at the function of the nervous system in a bit more detail. So this slide is showing you how the nervous system is arranged. So it's really just a summary of what we've previously been talking about. But all of this activity, all of this movement of activity that you can see by these arrows, the transmission of information, how does it all work? How does the nervous system function? Well, basically, every second the nervous system is functioning by receiving, interpreting, and acting on a whole range of stimuli from outside or inside of our body, from organs like the heart or tissues like muscle tissue. The important thing about nervous system function, just like we were talking about in our first session, that it has a pattern. It has a simple conceptual framework. And for each process we do in the body, each body process, there is a complete pathway of nervous activity from a stimulus to the response. Now this pathway has 5 basic parts, and we call this pathway a reflex arc. Now we're going to have a look at a simple reflex arc now in the next slide. So here is a simple reflex arc. It has 5 parts. First of all, it has a receptor. So in this slide, this guy here with his dodgy haircut has touched an iron, and it's on, and it's hot. Now he knows it's hot now because the receptor has sensed that environmental change, the hot temperature. The information from that receptor, hotness or pain, is passed now by a sensory neuron down towards the central nervous system. It is in the central nervous system, whether that be the spinal cord or the brain, that the interpretation and integration of nervous input takes place. Once interpretation has taken place and the response is decided upon, then the next part is the transmission of a message through a motor neuron, carrying the message for action away from the central nervous system. And finally, there's an effector, a muscle or gland that carries out a response. And in this case, it's the biceps muscle here. Biceps muscle contracts and pulls the finger or hand away from the hot iron. And this is a basic reflex, but it shows you very neatly how nervous information is passed, integrated in the body to allow for responses to happen. So this is just a very simple arc for a simple reflex. However, all of the nervous activity in the body works in this way, that somewhere along the line there will be a receptor. It might be just part of the nerve cell, but there is one. There will be a sensory part. There will be a passage of sensory information. That information is interpreted and then acted upon. And if you remember, when we showed the basic nerve cell, we could see that that's what went on, that information was received and then transmitted. And in between, it was integrated in the body of the nerve cell. Now, just for a moment, why don't you just think about your own reflex arc? Just think about the operation of what's going on in your body at this moment in time. And if you think carefully, you can probably think that for you to do things, then you need to have that reflex arc. So for instance, think about what you need to digest things. Think about the fact that you might need to sense where the food is. Think about you might need to sense what the food is made of. Think about you might need to secrete some digestive enzymes which break down that food. All of this will be controlled by reflex arcs. And perhaps you can see now, this is incredibly alike what we were talking about in terms of feedback loops. and in the way in which information is passed around in homeostatic mechanisms. A circuit of activity, a circuit of information. And the nervous system does this quickly and it does it efficiently. So the nervous system works on a whole series of reflex arcs, many thousands working at any one time. So that's how the system works. I want to return now to have a little bit of a look in more detail at the structures of the nervous system and what they do. So first of all, in this diagram, we can see the nervous system slightly cut down a bit, but it explains the two. See, you can see the two compartments. The central nervous system here, the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system coming off of that. The peripheral and central nervous system connect via two different types of nerves, the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. There are actually 12 pairs of cranial nerves arising from the base of the brain. We'll see those in a minute. And 31 pairs of spinal nerves, each of these numbered according to where they come out of the spinal cord itself. Now it's these nerves that then branch to form all of the nerve connections in the body. So let's have a look at the cranial nerves. So this is a picture, and you can see here, of a view from underneath the brain, looking upwards at the base of the brain. And you can very clearly see a number of projections. Now these are the cranial nerves. As briefly mentioned in the last slide, they're actually given the Roman numerals. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 cranial nerves. And the other thing that the clever ones amongst you will have noticed is they're in pairs. 1, 2, 1, 2. So for each side of the body there is a cranial nerve. They all have different functions. So for instance, the olfactory nerve here, that's to do with smell. The optic nerve to do with sight. The oculomotor nerve means the movement of the eye. Okay. These nerves here, for instance, the trigeminal nerve, very important. The ophthalmic one for the eye, the maxillary and the mandibular for the jaws. So for instance, when you go to the dentist, it's a branch of the trigeminal nerve that you have an injection in to anesthetize it. Down here, there's a number of other nerves, facial nerves for moving the facial expressions. Vestibulocochlear is a very long name, but basically it's to do with hearing. Now if you want to find out more about these nerves, there's a link here at the top. And if you go to that website, you'll be able to see an active map of the cranial nerves, and you'll be able to click on them and see which one is which and what it does. So those are the cranial nerves. Okay, this diagram, quite a neat diagram here, is showing you the spinal nerves. And this time, the spinal nerves are classified according to number, but also to the region of the spinal column that they originate from. So the different part of the the different parts of the vertebral column are notified by these letters. So C is the cervical region of the spinal column. Okay. T is the thoracic region. L is the lumbar region. And S is the sacral region. So these are the correct name and terminology for the spinal nerves. C1 through to C8, T1 through to T12, L1 through to L5, S1 through to S5. And down at the bottom here, we just have this one little nerve on its own, the coccygeal nerve, right at the base of the spine here. Okay. If you look at this picture over here, I'll draw my arrow to, this shows you in much more detail how these nerves arrive. So these nerves arise out of the spinal cord via roots, or what we call root filaments. So each nerve is actually attached to the spinal cord by two roots. Okay, and we could see that on the slide previously. The dorsal root, that's towards the back of the body, provides the input for sensory nerves. So the information going to the central nervous system goes in via the dorsal root. The ventral root, that's towards the front of the body, that takes output out to the body to glands and muscles. So there's an input at the dorsal root and an output at the ventral root. So this completes that nervous circuit we talked about from the very first slides. Input and output. So input goes into the spinal column by the dorsal root, and output comes out by the ventral root. The other thing you'll notice here, for instance, and here, is there's an awful lot of complicated wiring. And the nerve branches are all formed a network, and that's called a plexus. The reason why this happens here and here is because of the sheer number of nerves coming out at that point. Up here to move the arms and the hands, a lot of nervous activity, and down here to move the limbs, but also the nerves required to move the organs inside the abdominal cavity. So this is what we call a plexus, and you can see identified here three. Cervical plexus here, up in the neck, brachial plexus here at the top of the chest, and the lumbosacral plexus here at the base of the spine. Okay, these nerve plexuses are very important for wiring very complicated functional areas of the body. Now the neat thing about these nerves, all of these nerves, is they all go somewhere, and we can actually map them. So the sensory nerves that collect information from the body all feed into the spinal cord. We've seen that. They all feed in via the dorsal root. So every part of the skin surface, so every part of the sensory portions of the skin surface map on to one of those nerves. And if you look here, we have what we call dermatomes. Now the dermatomes are the regions of the skin associated with a specific nerve. So let's look here. So this is the back of somebody's head. So the sensory information, if you scratch the back of your head now, that sensory information is being passed in via C2. So it's been passed in via the C2 spinal nerve. Or if you now scratch your toes or the base of your foot, that nervous information is going in via S1, the sacral nerve 1. And as you can see, this is a steady map, a nice easy map for people to be able to check whether the sensory nerves are working properly. So if somebody had damage to their spine or their spinal column, then you might expect some of these nerves to not function properly. Knowing which part of the body that they connect to is a good way of them finding out which nerves are affected. So it's very easy to see what happens when, for instance, somebody has damage to their spinal cord. So you can see, for instance, if somebody has damage below the cervical region, then it's very clearly that all of these dermatomes may be affected, but they can still use and feel this part of the body. Okay, here's a diagram here. This diagram is one you've seen already, and it's about the organization of the nervous system. And if so, let's revise what we've just seen. The central nervous system interacts with the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system, the nerves that cover your body, have sensory or motor or movement functions. Now, the motor division, the movement part, has two parts. This, first of all, the somatic nervous system. I'm going to just poorly write in here. I can't spell today. There we go. Skeletal muscle. Okay. However, the other part of that moving nervous system, if you like, the motor division, is that autonomic nervous system. The role of the autonomic nervous system is to regulate the actions of the glands of the body, smooth muscle of the body, and the vessels of the body, and heart muscle. Now, collectively, we also can call this system the visceral system, because it is what is largely that drives your viscera or internal organs. Now, the thing about the autonomic nervous system is that this is an automatic system, and it's one that's made without a conscious awareness. So however hard you think, you can't control your digestion. However hard you think, you can't control your heart rate, nor filling of your bladder, or your blood pressure. These things can't be done consciously, because the autonomic nervous system does them all the time on a regular basis. So let's have a look at it with some facts now. We're going to see a picture of this in a minute, so don't worry too much about what I'm saying on this slide, because you'll see it in action in a very good diagram on the next slide. So for instance, all autonomic pathways, all of these control pathways contain two motor neurons connecting the spinal cord with the effector organ. Now these two motor nerves are connected at relay stations or connections called ganglia. Okay, and because there's a ganglia in the middle or a connection in the middle, we call one neuron a preganglionic neuron and the second a postganglionic neuron. Now these motor neurons, these neurons responsible for the movements in these automatic processes, are arranged in a distinct pattern, and we can separate them into two divisions: sympathetic division and a parasympathetic division. Now the thing to remember is that most organs are supplied by both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. And the other thing that you need to know is that the two types of nerves have different effects. So let's have a look at that diagram. This all might seem a little bit complicated, so let's have a look at the diagram. Okay. The diagram is showing you how the two parts of the nervous system work. So first of all, there's the sympathetic nervous system over here and the parasympathetic nervous system. For your convenience, the sympathetic nerves are given purple colours and the parasympathetic nerves green colours. The first thing that you're going to notice here is all of the different parts of the body are connected up to these nervous systems. It's the first thing that you'll notice. So, one of the things that you'll notice here is that you have the different parts of the spinal cord. Remember that? And this is showing you where the autonomic nervous system comes out. And if you remember from the past slide, it's from T1, so here, thoracic nerve, down to L2, the lumbar nerves, and they all then pass in. And if you follow the if you follow the train, so for instance, let's look at the nerve that comes out of here, the sympathetic nerve that comes out of here, passes down, and it reaches what we call that ganglion or relay center. There it joins up to a couple of nerves, one which goes to the bladder and genitalia, and another one which then goes to the colon. Okay, so this nerve has the responsibility of controlling those parts of the body. So if we reveal the numbers, we can see that we have a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system. We should note that each of the nerves comes out from a different part of the spinal cord. You can see that here. And that these nerves go to different organs in the body. Now the interesting thing, and I said this before, and you can see it very neatly on things like here, the pancreas. Note how the pancreas receives a nervous connection with the parasympathetic system and a nervous connection with the sympathetic system. Similarly with the liver, notice here how the heart here has a large amount of sympathetic innervation, large number of sympathetic nerves, but one of the cranial nerves here, cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, provides a connection here. So why have two parts of the system attached to each nerve, each tissue? Well, it's very important because one's sort of like an on switch and one's like an off switch. Now that's a very sort of crude explanation, but it follows actually that the sympathetic nervous system is really determining what we call action in the body. Okay? And what it's doing is that sympathetic nerves prepare the body for action and task. So all of the actions of the sympathetic nervous system will be to stimulate actions. So for instance, the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the heart to beat faster. Okay? It changes the diameter of blood vessels so that more blood flows faster and under more pressure. Now the parasympathetic nervous system has roughly the opposite effects. So it acts to control the heart, slowing it down. Now we can see this better on the next slide. So the sympathetic nervous system, here first of all, let's have a look at its effect on different tissues. So the first effect it has is on the pupils in the eye. And what does it do? It dilates them, so it opens them, allowing more light to come in, allowing you to have better vision. Now on the heart, the sympathetic nervous system increases its beat, enables more blood to be pumped around the body. In the lungs, in the airway of the lung, in the bronchi, the sympathetic system dilates it, therefore allowing more air to move in and out. Now perhaps you can see this pattern now, that these actions, these reactions here in these tissues, all of them will make the body better able to do something. And it's called the fight or flight reaction. So the sympathetic system works to prepare the body for action, either to fight something off or to run away from it or to do something active. And if we go down here, you'll see what happens to things like the digestive muscles when we need to run away or fight, is actually they decrease contraction, because there's no point in digesting your food if you're being chased by a monster. So it does things as well that actually prepare the body for action, or actions that are sympathetic to the body, and that's why we call it the sympathetic system. The actions that it does are sympathetic to the body, helping the body out. Now the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't mean that it's doing reactions that are not useful for the body. What it's actually doing, it is acting as a balance for the sympathetic system. So if we see, for the pupils of the eye, instead of dilation, constriction. For the heart, instead of an increased beat, it's a decreased beat. And for the lungs, instead of dilation of the airways, there's constriction. So there's sort of two opposing effects there, and they provide a balance. So that's why, and if we go back, that's why each of the organs and tissues, so something like the lungs, the heart, the stomach, the kidney, are all wired up to these two parts of the autonomic nervous system so that they're in balance. Okay? And if you remember yesterday when we talked about control in homeostasis, we said that a great part of control in the body was extrinsic control. And this is one of the key mechanisms of extrinsic control for the tissues and organs of the body, using the autonomic nervous system to regulate the actions and reactions of these tissues. And as you go through your course, you'll realize that the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are important. And one of the reasons why is that many of the drugs that you will be responsible for handing out to people, or even prescribing, if you get more advanced practitioners, these act on these systems. So for instance, let's take your inhaler. Let's take an inhaler for asthma. An inhaler for asthma acts in the same way as the sympathetic nervous system. Now that's not just a coincidence. It's because the drug itself acts and stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. So drugs that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system will cause these reactions. Okay? So for instance, you can see why a drug that might be used to increase your heartbeat might cause constipation, because it increases the beat of the heart, but it also decreases contraction of the digestive muscles. So here's a very, very, very important aspect of understanding these two systems, whether that be in the brain, whether that be in the rest of the body. That drugs are generally designed to work on these systems, either to actively promote the action or to inhibit it. So this is why it's important for you to know about this system. Okay, so I'm going to take a little sip of water, and then we're going to have a look at the central nervous system. Okay, so as we've mentioned a number of times before, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and spinal cord. So before we get to the sort of more complicated structures in the brain and what they do, let's have a look at that spinal cord again. So if you remember, part of the central nervous system, so it's encased in bone, so within the core of the vertebrae of the back of your spinal column is the spinal cord. Okay. Now the spinal cord is surrounded by protective membranes, and we'll see those later on, called the meninges. And it is also connected to the outside world, if you like, via spinal nerves. And we can see very, very clearly that each spinal nerve is attached to the spinal cord via a dorsal root and via a ventral root. Okay, so this is the ventral root here, effectively facing the front of the body, and this is the dorsal root, effectively facing the back of the body. those of you that did your anatomy homework will know dorsal means towards the back and ventral means towards the front. Okay. We also know that the spinal cord is named according to the region of the spine that it serves. So a cervical region, a thoracic region, a lumbar region, and a sacral region. Okay, so that's all stuff that we know. Next diagram adds a little bit more complexity. Because what this diagram is showing you is quite a neat little diagram. It's showing you how all these different parts you can see over here, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. This is showing you the effects of injury on these parts of the spine. Okay, so for instance, if you look up the top here, then you can say that a fracture up in the top region in between C1 and C5, so here a fracture up here is generally quite catastrophic because it causes the paralysis of some or all of the muscles used for breathing and arm and leg muscles. So typically this is a fatal spinal injury if the spinal cord is compressed or torn. Moving down, we get differing levels of paralysis. Okay, and you can see how, for instance, sacral nerves, you get damage to the sacral nerves, we end up with perineal numbness. So actually sensation in the perineal region down between the genitalia and the anus. So we can see there's a variation of effects depending on where paralysis occurs. So this is an incredibly useful diagram because it tells you not only the effects of spinal cord damage, but how they're related to the level of damage at which particular region. I'm going to take another closer look at the spinal cord now. So over here, we have some cross sections through the different parts of the spinal cord. Now these come from Gray's Anatomy, that very famous anatomy book, and it's a free book. You can find it on the web. If you just type in into Google Gray's Anatomy, you can find it. So these are sections taken at those different regions. So this is at C1 and this one's down at S2. And you'll notice some interesting coloration, some interesting patterns. Now what do they mean? Well, let's go down to about here, down to the lumbar region, and we can see a section here. And let's have a look at that in more detail over here. Okay, so what we can see, this is a section through the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the spinal cord itself. And the pairs of spinal nerves, you can see them quite clearly with the dorsal root and the ventral root going in to the spinal column. What you'll notice is the different coloration of the tissue here. So here, you can see it, rather looking sort of like a wonky butterfly, is what we call the grey matter. Now the grey matter of the spinal cord is grey for the very reason that it contains a high density of nerve cell bodies, the places where the nuclei are on the nerve cells. So with those nuclei, they give this darker coloration. Now surrounding that is the white matter. Now the white matter is the part of the nerve cells that carry the information, the axons, if you remember from that first diagram, the axons. So they're transmitting information. So they're also known as the nerve cell spinal cord tracts. So this is a very clever diagram showing you how this is arranged. And notice how these projections here and here and here and here in the grey matter tie up quite neatly to where the spinal nerves come in or go out. Okay, so that's the grey matter of the spinal cord. It's where all the connections of the nerves are made. It's where the connections of the nerves are made here in this grey matter. Okay, so what you also need to know is apart from that grey matter, this white matter is very, very ordered and structured too. Okay, so what we have here is, and it's drawn to show you, a section through the spinal column, again probably down nearer the lumbar region more than anywhere else, and some regions have been drawn on it and labelled. And what's interesting about it is that it tells you two things. All the blue ones are what we call sensory nerve tracts. Okay, so these are like the transmitting parts of the sensory nerves, and you can see here C, TH, L, and S. So we can map the exact regions of the spinal cord where the nerves from the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral are. We can also see that this is called the ascending tracts. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because the information, sensory information, goes in and up the spinal cord, into the spinal column, up towards the brain. Now, when a decision is made to move something, the information comes out and goes down. It's descending. So the descending tracts here, you can see in red, you can see, so there's one here, and there'll be one, and there'll be others over here too. Yeah. So don't think that they're just on one side. They're not. It's just showing you that where they are. So there'll be pairs. Yeah. So there's like a mirror image here and here. Yeah. So you can see how put together. Okay. So all of those nerve cells travel up and down in sort of defined routes. Okay. So it's rather like, the spinal cord is rather like a very big cable containing many, 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 many different wires, each going to different parts of the body, coming from the brain, going to the brain. Okay? Now you don't need to know this, but the descending tracts are known as corticospinal tracts, meaning they're coming from the cortex of the brain and going down the spine. And the sensory ones are known as spinothalamic tracts. Spino because they're coming from the spine up to the thalamus in the brain. But we can just call them ascending and descending tracts. Okay. So that's the spinal cord. Very, very important route for sensory and motor nervous information. Now let's move on and have a look at the biggest lump, and perhaps the most important lump of nervous tissue that we have in the body, the brain. Okay? Now, one of the things that you will note about the brain is its characteristic structure. You'll notice that it has these many folds, okay? And they're called gyri, okay? So these are the folds of the brain. Now the grooves here are called the sulci, okay? And you'll see in a minute we need to know these names because we can use them to point out different regions of the brain, okay? And we can see that happening in a minute. Now, this folding and grooving only really happens after birth and as we develop. So as we develop towards adulthood, this folding becomes more and more defined. In this picture over here is a scan. This is a scan of the brain of a fetus. And you'll notice it's almost smooth here. There are some folds, you can see them, I've probably just drawn over them, but there's a few folds here. But actually nowhere near the sort of folding and grooving that you can see in this brain. And this is a sign that the brain is developed and this brain is not. Okay, so the brain's complex. We know many, many different regions. We know it has many, many different functions. So how are we going to look at it? Well, I've always taught the brain in three parts. And I've always started from the bottom up. So I've always started from the bottom up because at the bottom is where the spinal cord arises. Okay, so this is where the information will come into the brain. Okay, the three parts I'm going to talk about are the brainstem, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So let's start. Okay, hopefully you'll be able to see the different regions because I've coloured them. I've given them a spray paint just to show you the different parts that I'm talking about. So the first bit we're talking about is one of the most important areas of the brain. Okay, it's one of the main survival areas of the brain, and in fact, somebody is classified dead when this part of the brain is dead too. So we've heard of probably brainstem death. And the reason why death is classified through lack of activity in this region is it's because where all the major survival parts of the body are, controlling the cardiac region, cardiac, respiratory function, consciousness, all of those things are controlled within these regions. And starting from the bottom, we have three areas, something called the medulla oblongata, or the medulla, the middle region of the pons, and the top bit of the midbrain. Okay, so that's the brain stem. And when we talk about the control of things like heartbeat and respiration, it's in these areas here. So this is where the control centers are that decide how fast you breathe, how deep you breathe, your heart rate, etc., etc. So very, very important part of your brain. Okay, the next part is something called the diencephalon. Okay, and it's here, and I've sprayed it a nice pink color. This is a very, very important part of the brain because it's where most of the sensory information goes into the body. Remember I was talking about how spinal cord tracts are sometimes called the spinothalamic tracts because they go from the spine to the thalamus. Well, the thalamus is up in this region. This is the area where all information seems to cross over in the brain, not just physical information like sensation or smell or touch, or it's also emotion, it's also thought, it's also decisions. They all seem to cross over in this central part of the brain, the thalamus. Now what I've drawn here is I've drawn an arrow to show you where the pituitary gland should be. It's missing from this brain, but it should be sort of down here like this. We'll see the pituitary gland tomorrow, and we'll talk about its importance then when we talk about the endocrine system. Okay, now there are two parts to this brain. There's a lower and an upper part. We'll talk about the upper part first. This is what we call the thalamus. Then we'll talk about the lower part, the hypothalamus. Okay, two very, very important parts of the brain. So first of all, the thalamus. Now here it is, sits here like two eggs. Okay, you notice that it's paired, so that's a characteristic of the brain, that there are paired structures, one on either side. This is a very neat diagram and explains all the different parts of the thalamus. So it explains where the different outputs are and the different regions. Okay, so it's telling you that the thalamus is organized into different relay centers, going to different parts of the body. But it really is one of the body's major relay centers. Information comes in and then it is sent elsewhere. For those of you doing mental health nursing, the thalamus is at the heart of modern concepts of how emotions are formed, how we behave, because it's information passing through, streaming through this thalamus that then gets sent and to other parts of the brain. And things like memory and things like emotion all get coordinated through this. Okay, the next thing to talk about is the hypothalamus. And similarly, this is a much more complex structure than you would originally see. And what's been drawn on here are blocks of activity. So for instance, telling you that different parts of the hypothalamus do different things. So up here you can see that we know that there are different parts of the hypothalamus which are responsible for receiving sensation and interpreting sensation from different parts of the body. So for instance, body temperature regulation here, known to be in this part. Okay? Things like blood pressure in this part. Things like hunger and satiety, that is feeling full, in this part. And other sensations from the gastrointestinal tract in this part. So we know that the hypothalamus is a very, very important part of the brain. It is the sensory center of the brain. It is the homeostatic center of the brain. All of the homeostatic functions of the body all seem to be connected through the hypothalamus in some way. It receives all the information, sensory information, and it makes sense of it, passes that information on to different parts of the brain. Okay, so these two, the hypothalamus and the thalamus, are receiving and relay centers. Well, what are they passing on to? Well, they're passing on to different parts of the body, but they're also interacting with the next big part of the brain, which is the cerebrum, which is what most people think of as the brain. So you can see it occupies the biggest amount of space, and it does an awful lot of things. The cerebrum is complicated, but we can actually split it into a number of regions. So here are your regions. You'll notice, just like, and here's the beauty of this, just like the spinal column, they're named according to the bones where the region is associated with. So in your skull, you have a frontal bone, a parietal bone, and an occipital bone, and a temporal bone. So underneath them, you have a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, an occipital lobe, and a temporal lobe. It's very simple to remember. If you remember the bones, you remember the regions. If you remember the regions, you remember the bones. So this is a very sort of crude map of the brain. Okay. If we take a slice through this, if we were to sort of take a slice through this part of the brain, we'd see something like this. We'd see, here are the folds, so you can see in the grooves, you can see the folds, so there's a fold here, and a groove in here. Okay, so what we would notice is that when you look at this, and this has been specially stained, is there is a couple of regions. So there's an inner part here, so there's an inner part, and then an outer part. Now the outer part is called the cortex, the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is where all of the systems for command and control for the different parts of the body are. Let's have a look at how they're organized here. Okay, so we talk about cortex or cortical areas. And on this diagram we can see that different parts, and notice how they map nicely onto those folds that we were talking about. They all have different roles. So Broca's area here, speech. The primary auditory cortex for hearing. The primary visual cortex for seeing. The primary motor cortex for moving. And then other things like the premotor cortex. Now the premotor cortex is involved in deciding to move, how to move. The primary somatosensory cortex, you can see here in this specific gyrus called the central gyrus, is what we call the somatosensory. Somato, if you remember guys, means body, sensory means sensation. So this part of the brain here is responsible for sensing what's going on throughout the body. So if we take a section, if we were to sort of take a section through this area here and look at it, it would look something like this. So this is that section. Okay, this is the section of the brain Okay, that's somatosensory cortex. So the cortex, you can see it's grey around the outside here. And what you can note is that we know and we can map the different areas of responsibility. So where the sensation is coming from. Okay, and then on top of that, what's been drawn is a body. And the body has been drawn with proportions that match the size of the region of the brain that serves them. So just look at this, for instance. Look at the size of the hand here. The hand's big because a significant portion of the cortex is there to do with the hand. Now again, look at the lips. They're huge. That's because a significant portion of the brain surface here is responsible for the lips. So we end up drawing this homunculus. Okay, so we can map the different parts of the brain that are responsible for sensation in different areas. Okay, and it really tells us where the areas of major sensation are in the hands and in the face, in the lips, tongue, etc. Now, you can actually draw this person now as if they existed. And there they are. Very neat, eh? But if you know, this is a person drawn according to the amount of brain area that is responsible for that function. So this person has huge hands. That's because a significant part of their brain is there to control their hands. Huge lips and mouth, because a significant part of the brain is there to control that part of the body. Big eyes, because a significant part of the brain is there to control them. Okay, but relatively less for the arms, say for instance, and the legs. It's bigger for feet, but not so big as the hands. So this is the homunculus. Okay, and if you see this person, you should report him to the police. Okay, so coming to the end of our tour of the brain now, there's another part of the brain that we've seen and not concentrated on here at the back. This is called the cerebellum. Literally means the little brain. Now the cerebellum is quite important. The cerebellum, if it's damaged, we see that people with damaged cerebellum don't move so smoothly. They don't move as coordinatedly as other people. So we know that smooth, coordinated movements are actually the responsibility of this structure. Okay? And we also know that the cerebellum hardwires those movements. So imagine that you're learning to play the guitar. You start off, you pick up a guitar, you're all ham-fisted. You can't coordinate yourself. You can't get a note. But if you keep trying and you keep practicing, there will come a time where you unconsciously can pick up a guitar and play a tune without very little effort. And the reason you can do that is because all the muscle actions and responses needed to play that instrument, not just guitars, but violins and trumpets or whatever, or wood carving or playing badminton or riding a bike or sewing or embroidery or cross stitch, anything that you need to do in a fine coordinated manner with your hands or with another part of your body is coordinated through the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is an important part of the body for fine coordinated planned action. Okay, now we're just about finished. I just wanted to spend some time at the end talking about how the nervous system is protected, particularly the central nervous system and the brain and the spinal cord. Now, you've heard the term meningitis. Well, meningitis is an inflammation of the meninges. Now, the meninges are the protective covering, protective membranes of the central nervous system. So looks a bit complicated here, but basically this is a section through the skull. So here's the skin, okay, you can see that. So here's the skin, here's down now to the skull. So this is the skull. Okay, so what I'm colouring in here is the skull. It's the cranium. So underneath the skull, you will now see the 3 layers of the meninges, and they're over here. First of all, on the very inside, in very close contact with the outside of the brain, sitting in all its folds and grooves, is a tissue-like structure called the pia mater. Then outside of that is a web-like, spider-like structure here, and that's called the arachnoid. Remember, arachnid, the spider. This is the arachnoid mater. Okay, and on the outside, this is the dura mater. Okay, it literally means dura, meaning tough, and mater, meaning mother. So this is one tough mother. The pia mater means intimate. Mother. And the arachnoid mater means the spider-like mother. Now, why would we want to know about this? Well, I've already said that meningitis is a significant disease. But the other thing that you would like to know here is when somebody bangs their head, when they have an accident, or when they have a bleed on the in the brain. And you've probably heard a number of terminologies related to these layers. So somebody can have a subdural hematoma. That is a blood clot or bleed subdura. So it means it's below that layer. A more serious type of bleed or hemorrhage is a subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's in this very blood-rich area here below the arachnoid layer. So that's the first reason why you'd like to know about the meninges, because it gives you the locations of where bleeds occur. The other thing is that anesthetically, see here, there's the epidural space. So this is where one might inject an epidural anesthetic. So because the meninges pass all the way down the spine and cover the spinal cord as well, that's where you do your epidural. So the epidural anesthetic goes into this space here and therefore anesthetizes the spine at that region and prevents the nerve transmission, the pain transmission from that region. And just to show you that, I'll show this on this. So those are the 3 layers, and let's show you how that then passes on into the spinal column. So this is a cross section, and you can see again the intimate mother, the arachnoid layer, the arachnoid mother, and the dura mater here. So you can see how those meninges cover not only the brain, but also the spinal column. Okay, so that's a tour, very brief tour of the important bits of the human nervous system. Remember, the human nervous system there is to provide communication. It's to communicate between different processes, to coordinate different processes in the body. It's to coordinate homeostasis. It's to integrate sensory information with movement or motor information. Some of this is done voluntarily. Some of it's done automatically, unconsciously, via the autonomic nervous system. Remember, the autonomic nervous system is important for controlling body processes. and we can use drugs to control it. Remember that the nervous system has a central and peripheral part, and you now know the different components of those. So the nervous system, very, very important in communication in the body. The second part of the communication systems we will talk about tomorrow morning is the endocrine system. And we'll do that first thing tomorrow morning.